During the pentagram rite, I saw shadows that differed in their movement from those coming off of me, and those that naturally seemed to appear in the room. With the first set of vibrations, I saw like a pink wavy cloud about the size of a hand in between the fake candle and the top of the glass. In the second set of vibrations, shadows grew and turned red. During the final reading, those shadows had a moving pink in them as well. With the third set of vibrations, I heard a rolling and rumbling sound in the north, and it dragged on for about a minute. With the fourth set of vibrations, there was sort of a checkered pattern of white, but no other colors, no other substance, just the white checkers. And they tended to be vertical. With the fifth set, it was like the awareness of outside the ritual shut off. No sound, no wind, nothing. But there was like a sense of a pull from my fingers and my toes. During the final reading, I at times saw the pages glow purple, and this purple violet glow was accompanied with a pleasing warmth and euphoria. During the final scrying, that euphoria became more of a pulsing and scouring down. There was a loosening up, and I saw streaks of that same sort of purple and violet, blended together, but you can see both at the same time. And my hands, face, and feet were a bit light, and that connected to spots on the ceiling, wall, and floor. The succubus reminds us that some things may show you their own reality. But certainly, when some things are welcomed and allowed to do what they will, they may just be doing things their own way, which is not what we expected. Nobody reminds us when there's no one to blame that could be the worst affliction coming. Danegeld reminds us that between what's considered godly and devilish, what is considered the body's way is usually established. Trudge body reminds us of the discontent of our condition. When we're at one extreme, we want the other extreme. Music at night reminds us of the harmony of existence and how each can play its part without pride. Without pause reminds us to go on as the world cycles around us. The clockman reminds us that time is such that, well, things are beyond time, but we need to think of things in terms of time. And I'm recording this in one of the worst weeks of productivity of the year. You know, the 2 weeks after the time changes, there's a drop in productivity. The Mondays, like, today's a Monday. These 2 Mondays are deemed Suicide Monday because of, people get thrown off by the time change. We're not meant to, we live by nature. We don't live by, just some changing the label of the time. The Commons of Sleep addresses the collective unconscious. It also seems to hint at a certain personal control of the themes that you let into your life, even in the sleeping state. What times are these? Indicates that there's something to some degree separate from the rest of society. And this separateness involves there's a force that uses usury and other sorts of stuff. And it's directing us towards death as a society. The Christmas robin, I don't know if robins and a bunch of other things that people consider as signs of a good winter coming or a bad winter coming, and I think they just come out in certain conditions. Like, one of the things that they say is a really bad sign of a winter, well, those fuzzy caterpillars, it's actually what they were exposed to, not what they're going to be exposed to. Certain mercies remind us that there may not be two sides to issues. The curious seers of the frontier reminds us how cultures merge and how Christianity is, in a way, a version of the Roman Empire without an empire. Much like what happened with Khazaria, right? How it set up a system, and that system merged with other systems beyond nations. Callow Captain reminds us that beyond work, we have other roles. The Stranger reminds us that there are those not yet of personal connection to be motivated by. The Smoky House reminds us of interpretation, taking the edge off. Variables of Green reminds us to make distinctions between the living and other things of whatever category. The Goblet reminds us that some will have a special cup, a special thing, and to them it represents what they have earned. Fiend, Dragon, Mermaid reminds us that it's not the external entities, but that category of entity in yourself that you have to deal with. Fragment of a Lost Poem reminds me of a lot of the writing that I have done, that I've thought of something, or I was working on something, and then I redo it or I try to reconstruct it, and it doesn't seem as good as it was when it first came about. Galatea and Pygmalion reminds us that the external monster is what it is because of itself and not because of the other. The devil's advice to storytellers reminds us that we are such that, the stories, if there's issues with them, that may make them more intriguing than if they were perfect. Lunch Hour Blues reminds us that that whole thing is about self-control and discipline. Hotel Bed at Lugano reminds us to treat journeys like a holiday and to live as if one never had to go through certain things. I mean, certainly try to make the right decisions and maybe safer decisions, but, progressive housing addresses something that became more of an issue later on, is these things for show, but yet the homes aren't as lasting or whatever as they used to be. So why are we doing this if it doesn't make things better for us overall and all that? Certainly you do want efficient heating and sturdy windows and all that sort of stuff, but then again, is that what's going on with the presentation? Letta seems to address someone being weighed down by theology, or their sense of theology. The Florist Rose reminds us that the feeling behind something can outweigh the artificial form that is connected to it. Being tall, well, not everybody's jealous like people may think of such things, but like in the poem, you do use your position towards benefit rather than, I have power over people. At first sight can kind of remind us how people approach things with uncertainty, and that uncertainty paves the way for the relationship that can spring from that, and then that's going to be remembered. Recalling war is how people are brought to motivations of, how grand what they're doing is, or how good it is, or whatever, and then they find out what it is and they realize it just made things worse. X, just a letter, because some would spell it with the E before, and that would mean something else. There's an unknown. And in our lives, there's an unknown. And how's it going to be? And what's the decision about it? Parent to children is how, the parent has a reaction. And they don't have, the fact where people are placed in the family versus the other, it's like, it's not personal. To challenge delight kind of reminds me of that HBO movie, The Believer. The one with the neo-Nazi Jew. What he said about Maybe because you're just so happy or something like that. To walk on hills is to be active. It's to let nature speak to you. It's to have nature divert you. To bring the dead to life is to consciously stir up the memory and the legacy. To evoke posterity reminds me of the conflict over the abortion issue and how it really is, rather than being a moral or scientific issue. Any honest housewife reminds that honesty can be just as much about duty as in telling the truth. Defeat of the rebels reminds that, well, the winning side had losses too. And the motivation of the losing side was the one that found disfavor. So you don't, that side being properly represented in history isn't always a necessary thing. The grudge addresses the suffering and how the grudge itself can be the hardship entirely. But sometimes that's maintenance. Never such love reminds us that even in separation, even in not taking the side of the other, that doesn't have to interfere with the actual love. The halfpenny reminds us of how coins that aren't mint remind of an individual's own fortune, their own decay, the one's own sense of a thing that, hey, you may not be worth much to others. The fallen signpost reminds us that there's gaps in what may be called guidance. And those gaps leave us with work to do. I mean, even if you have a perfect scripture to work with, you still have to think and act for yourself. The china plate reminds us of the niceties that can be appreciated while they last, and how they can become part of a way of life. Idle hands reminds us that the start of things is often about just having things, things going wrong, is to just not do things. Maintenance, at the least. The laureate reminds us that maybe we shouldn't rely on attention. A jealous man reminds us that deprivation can be the force to cure jealousy. The cloak reminds us that sometimes the clothes do make the man, but of course they have to let that connection flow. That's why you put on costumes and rituals and stuff, right? A country mansion reminds us that it's the people that make a home. The eremites remind us that suppression and abstinence are not the same thing as self-control, perhaps. But maybe when that's there, then one is beset on a different level. Advocates almost comes off like a Christmas tree hunt. Self-praise does get into the area of, those people who make a big deal. They have to tell you about their clothes. Their clothes are great because they told you about them, and other such things. The challenge reminds us that those in the higher positions in this life still have to go through a sense that they, there's accomplishment to have. To the sovereign muse reminds us that there's things to outdo. And some senses of what we should be doing, those have to be put aside. The ages of oath reminds us of the connections of discovery, that things that really have nothing to do with what is discovered will be associated in thought. Like snow, reminds us that wonders happen when we're not paying attention. The climate of thought reminds us that there are details to discover that are the reality. End of play reminds us that we were brought low by the realization of reality. But we go on hoping. The fallen tower of Siloam reminds us that it's usually better that we're not ones to mock. There is a history to learn from. The great-grandmother reminds us that the treatment of one relative doesn't mean that the same treatment is towards another relative. The poem called No More Ghosts reminds us of those with ease after hardship sayings. And let not the connections to old things keep us from doing what needs to be done here. Leaving the rest unsaid reminds us not to ramble on, but to set the mood for leaving things aside. The glutton reminds us of the difference of how things are versus how things were. It used to be, okay, you work together, but you wish you didn't have to share, and now you wish you could share, and now people aren't in the shape that they used to be. A love story comes off more like a Taylor Swift song, doesn't it? That, hey, it was what it was for the time, except a Taylor Swift song is like all about blaming the guy, and it's like, oh, come on, you lied to each other. The Thieves kind of brings the same point, that people wrong each other. To sleep reminds us that we should do and say what we need to do or say, and then let us drift away regardless of what has, gone by and how that's impacted us. Dawn bombardment reminds us not to waste the dawn. The worms of history is, one of those thinking about continuing the Bible things. And no, he wasn't claiming that's a new revelation and all that sort of stuff, but, it talks about the eighth day. It's almost Nietzschean, right? But then again, it's not God that died. It's humanity that died spiritually because they let that part of their life die, or wither at the least. A withering herb is, of course, a plant metaphor, but it does remind us that some choices have a lasting impact. The shot addresses speculation, hypothesis, that sort of thing. But then again, that's how we live. If we just let facts or guesses sit by themselves and never articulate, never lead to effort. Dream of a climber is how most people tell their heroic stories. They don't, some people say, oh, I got this scar here, but they try to make things smoother in the telling as far as how things were for them, rather than, honestly how some stuff comes about in a way that you would never do it again. Lollocs remind us that people will fill in the gaps in ways that are harmful to themselves. Having never perceived something, they will just believe it is. Culpability is important. Despite and still has the sense of maybe we shouldn't be getting into ifs implied, I guess. At least, from how it's coming across to me. But definitely how taking account is not, always a beneficial thing. The suicide and the cops reminds us that those who go through that will be judged by others. They'll try to figure out how it happened, that sort of stuff. Frightened men are ones that, are trying to put meaning into things, but meaning in a way that's not honest with the narrative. It's better not to tell people all of your flaws and all that sort of stuff, too, A stranger at the party reminds us that when people do things like that, they show up as uninvited, etc., etc. Despite what happens as a result, and maybe they're favored by people, that it's not best for people to encourage that sort of behavior because, maybe one person's like that and you remember that. The oath reminds of the concept of marriage, that each in itself, their terms are also the terms of the other. Things are brought out into the open. Disputes take place. There's inner reaction. Language of the seasons reminds us that we have to have a way in the different circumstances. And as far as relationships, we need to weave that into some sort of workable tapestry. Midwinter waking is like the Indian summer, as they call it. I don't know the politically correct term. Heat wave in winter. Where I'm at, we had some abnormally early cold, record-breaking cold, and then we have this non-winter weather. It has elements of spring, but it's not quite spring. The rock at the corner isn't like the biblical reference of Mecca, but It's more that there's work that was left undone in terms of presentation and building, and it's not having been necessary to shape it like the other places means that it's a point of the building that people remember. The beach reminds us that some things happen and then a whole group gets associated with that. The villagers and death reminds us that when it comes to burial and stowing of bodies and all that, there are things that are unexpected. And particularly, as I've pointed out before, that when we're getting into stuff like the, waiting for burial and prepping the bodies and all that stuff, then you run into even more issues. If you just clean off the body, wrap it, put it in the ground, you don't run into that as much. Sometimes people's actions are connected to something, and the door kind of draws that point home. And some buildings you leave never to return, or some leave a building never to return, and that's sort of the sense, because some people, the last you see them is the opening of a door. And I remember in 2005, the last I saw somebody was they went out a door. Under the pot, or you could say outside the pot, reminds us that when things are put through a process, what occurs with that is not always so calculated. Through nightmare reminds us that often the whole aspect of it being a nightmare is the whole unknown thing. To Lucia at birth reminds us that we are born into situations to respond to, a past that will be known, and we can't change the past, and we shouldn't in some ways let the past change us. Death by drums reminds us that music is not always so beneficial, but remember, Robert Graves was a vet, and as a vet, the sounds of war often included music. Just like nowadays, people from my country are well known for their torturing people, particularly foreigners, with music in the background. She tells her love while half asleep, reminds us that appreciation and emotion and all that sort of stuff, it's there, but when people are thinking of it more, when things are going along with more effort, then, it may not be mentioned. Instructions to the Orphic adept. Well, it is partially from a translation, it says, and it does remind us of what initiation is supposed to do to us. Like, for example, the name of the chapters here literally means degrees, steps of a structure. So whether you have fully attained to a particular one of those 114 initiatory steps, or you are going through the text, that's the sort of thing it's supposed to do. And, you're called as an Orphic initiate towards memory, action, what you take in, to have a sense of your internal response, your unconscious. Theseus and Ariadne reminds us that those we address may not be in the position, higher or lower, that we think they are. But then again, you be good to people of each. Equanimity, it's called. Seeing everyone as equal. Well, you're not being deluded into thinking that everybody's equal, but, you can't always tell by the outer, and you have to be just either way. Lament, or pacify, reminds us as things fade away that our perception of them is not always, hey, they're there too. Don't make assumptions. The 12 days of Christmas almost seems astrological, doesn't it? Nature is in the details. Cold weather proverb reminds us that there's different things to pay attention to. Are you going to pay attention to your own state? Some external sign? Or the momentum, the feeling? I might have better said station instead of state as the first part. To wan at the winter solstice reminds us that we may only get one chance. And what we relate is something that's supposed to relate to action. The Persian version reminds us that there's tides that turn, and that victories are not really flukes of fate. The weather of Olympus reminds us that, things are different nowadays. You can schedule things based on the weather. But not if you have to have tickets. You just schedule things and, hope the weather turns out right. Well, it turns out right, but you know what I mean. Favorable for your goals. Apollo of the physiologists reminds us that there is something more living than the dumbed down references of what are called gods. The oldest soldier can kind of remind us of the great accomplishment that comes when we're not just doing things our own way, and we've given up on trying to sneak in our own way. Grotesques reminds us that the unpolished pictures of what life is shows its grandness. The eugenist kind of warned us of what was coming. Well, something exaggerated in World War II, but certainly, 100,000 disabled people? Something more than that. The real Holocaust, it was, a significant total of the dead, more than a quarter of the people dead. But it's really what we promote as something to survive. Not just some ancestry or something like that, but actual character, culture. And I don't think we can tell that sort of thing by looking at a person. And I think the evidence shows that things are more how people are raised and the personal life that they choose rather than any of that other stuff. And